everybody, and thanks for coming. I'm Becky Jason. I own the Vermont Book Shop, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the third installment of our nascent partnership with the Marquee Theater, which we have playfully dubbed Get Lit, a play on the pairing of books and adult beverages, both of which are available for sale this evening. I'd like to thank Ben Wells, who's the Marquee owner, and his staff for their generosity in providing this space. Ben and I are both passionate community advocates, but our businesses need your support to survive. So please, if you can, spread a little love. Don't forget to tip the bartender. Our featured guest this evening is Jason Lutes. He is the author of the newly published collection, Berlin, which Forbes called one of the most ambitious, important, and fully realized works of graphic literature yet created, a real masterpiece of both story and art. Lutes is a graduate of Rhode Island School of Design with a BFA in illustration. In 1993, he began drawing a weekly comics page called Jar of Fools for the Seattle alt weekly, The Stranger. In 1996, Jason embarked on the ambitious project of a 22-chapter story set in the twilight years of Germany's Weimar Republic. Berlin was originally published in separate volumes, the final of which just recently published simultaneously with the beautiful omnibus edition, which we're selling here tonight. There are a couple, there's one volume 1 and one volume 2 in the paperback single volume editions, but if you bought those two, you might as well buy the whole thing. So. But if that's what you were hoping to get was a paperback edition and you sell out of them, I'm happy to special order them for you. Since 2008, Jason has lived in where in Vermont? What town are you in? Because we're in Heartland, Vermont, with his partner and their 2 children. He teaches comics at the Center for Cartoon Studies in White River Junction. Conversing this evening with Jason is one of our hometown heroes, or my hometown hero anyway, Jack Mayer, the beloved pediatrician. He is also the author of Life in a Jar, the Irina Sendler Project, and Before the Court of Heaven. Set in Germany between the wars, Before the Court of Heaven is a novel based on the true story of a German assassin turned French legionnaire. The American Library Association called it gripping from the first line, offering an immersive, exciting, and often heartbreaking story. It was the historical context of Jack's novel and his extensive understanding of that era, which I think grew out of your Irina Sendler Project book, I believe. Am I right? Did it start before that?
It started before.
Okay. Well, anyway, Jack's extensive knowledge of this was what caused my colleague and me, Jenny and me to ask him to be here tonight with Jason. I am so grateful to him for being willing to take the time out of his evening to be on stage with Jason as my better informed surrogate. So thank you, Jack. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. So
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks to the Vermont Book Shop and the Marquee for having us here. It's really great, and thank you all for coming out. So I'm here to talk about this book that I made, and I'm assuming most of you have not read it. And comics are a little, it's different than if I wrote a prose novel and I was going to make an appearance at a bookstore where I might just read a passage from the novel, right? Because it's words and it's meant to be often read aloud. Comics don't really work that way. So in lieu of reading you my comics, which would be redundant if I put them up on screen, they're better experienced in the book anyway. It's a very, books are a very intimate experience, and comics really take advantage of that. I think what I'll tell you is just briefly what my book is about, which has sort of already been covered in summary. And then talk a little bit about, I guess the one of the salient facts about this book is it's 22 chapters long, and it took me 22 years to write and draw it. So I started it when I was 28 years old, and I turned 50 last December. And I drew the last page the week before my 50th birthday. Yeah, it was a little present to myself. I was also, I thought I was going to be done by the time I was 40, so I was 10 years late on that. So I'm just going to talk a little bit briefly about the book itself, so you have some idea of what it covers, and then about the my background and influences that led me to this crazy decision to spend 22 years of my life working on this book. It follows, the book starts off with a young woman from Cologne, Germany, traveling to Berlin for the first time in 1928 on a train, and on the train she meets a journalist who has lived in the city most of his life. So in the, we call these boxes panels, for those of you who don't know that. Sometimes people call them frames, but in the parlance of the comics medium, each one of these frames is called a panel. This is a 2-page spread, so when you open up this book, that big image on the left is on the left-hand page, and this more complicated page is on the right. And this is a moment where one of the main characters, this young woman named Martha Muller, is kind of overwhelmed by the city because it's the first time she's ever been to a kind of metropolis. And so you see one, but on the third, sort of 2/3 of the way down that page, you see that kabash sound effect because 2 cars just ran into each other, and those are the 2 main characters in that panel. The journalist Kurt in the foreground and the art student Marta in the background. Over the course of my story, starting with those 2 characters, I kind of follow them on their on their sort of journey through the city as they each interact with different people. And one of my initial goals in writing this story was to try to depict or show all different strata of German society at the time. I really wanted to understand who was living there, who was living in Berlin, what they were doing. You know, on the right we have a page of a kind of aristocratic cocktail party that's going on. On the left we have the journalist taking the tram home and feeling really kind of depressed about the state of the world. So I'm exploring the lives of many, many different characters in many different social situations. There's flashbacks to World War I, which of course was called the Great War. They didn't know it was just the first one at the time. And it had, World War I had incredible effect, of course, on all of Europe and Germany in particular. So I try to sort of touch on that a little bit. This is a sort of flashback dream that somebody has about that. If you look in the lower right there's a number of panels, or word balloons that have no words in them. That's not a typo, that's on purpose. I do get emails from people saying that there's a mistake in the printing, but that's supposed to show that they can't hear anything because an artillery shell is going off and they're stressed out. Sometimes you make experimental choices like that and they're not interpreted the way you intend. Another set of characters is this Jewish family, the Schwartzes. You can see all 4 of them there in the second tier. Each level of panels is called a tier, T-I-E-R, like a wedding cake. And you read them top to bottom. In that second tier on the right-hand page there is the 4 people who comprise the Schwartz family. And they kind of generationally represent different levels of assimilation into German society, with David, the youngest, being kind of the most German of this family. Of course, you can't have a story about Weimar Berlin without there being political frictions. The 2 major groups that were clashing in the street at the time were the Communists and the National Socialists. There were many other political factions trying to claim their part of public life, and so there's a number of situations in the story where there is a clash in the streets and then the police step in to break it up. And then there's more organized demonstrations like this, which was the May Day demonstration of 1929, which ended in tragedy with a number of people being shot and killed by the police. And then of course you can't have Berlin in the 20s without a little nightlife. So there's several times in the story where parts of it take place in nightclubs or in the kind of world of that society. I try as much as possible, even though this is about the kind of rise of fascism and the great darkness that's about to descend on Europe, I try as much as possible to pay attention to the lives of the people and the kind of joy and fun that they were having in the midst of all that. And there's lots of drawings of buildings. I'm known for drawing buildings, for better or for worse. It's kind of a curse because they take a long time to draw. But one of the things I discovered is if you take the time to do it well and to do it with attention, the more attention you put into the page, the more attention the reader will give you, I discovered, which makes complete sense, but it wasn't something I thought consciously about. So, and also there's a sense of if you do your research and you get the environments right, then your reader is that much more likely to kind of buy into the truth of your story, right? So by putting work into the environmental details and really trying to create a sense of place, ideally I will help the reader feel like they're right there on the street. So a little bit about me. I grew up in Missoula, Montana until the age of 10. In downtown Missoula, right where the two big streets cross, there was a little shop, and the first shop on the block there called Garden City News, which was a combination comic magazine smoke shop. Every Saturday morning, my dad would take me down there. I'd have, I think, a quarter allowance in my pocket that I could spend on whatever. And my dad would go get his pipe tobacco. And I'd walk in the front doors of the shop, across these creaky wooden floors to the rear corner, which looked something like this. This is just an internet image, but it captures the feeling of what it was like. I think it's from the nods in the audience, I see some people who had similar experiences growing up. You could go in the back corner of this shop, plunk yourself down, and just read to your heart's content. Luckily, the owners of this shop were very permissive that way. They didn't try to kick you out. They would just let you lie there and figure out how to spend your allowance. My dad would go run errands in downtown Missoula and then come back an hour later, and I probably still wouldn't have figured out what to spend my quarter on. But among the things I did spend my allowance on were classic, mainstream American superhero comics like these, many of which are now in your local Cineplex, much to my surprise. I mean, 10-year-old me would have been utterly blown away by that. But I loved X-Men and Captain America and the Avengers. I also loved Western comics. I'm a child of, my dad was a French literature professor, and that's why we lived in Montana. He taught at the University of Montana. It was a strange irony that I was the son of an academic living basically in the Wild West. But it was still a fantasy, to like want to be a cowboy, even though I was basically living out there. And then an even weirder, strange thing, my sister's adopted, she's Native American, and we would play cowboys and Indians, which I think is pretty messed up in retrospect. But I had this aspiration to be a cowboy. We're all kids, right? Like I was 10 years old. It was clear that cowboys could be children according to the titles of these comics. So I was really into them. My dad, as I said, taught at the University of Montana. And as a member of that circle, the social circle of professors and academics, American mainstream comics were looked down on. So superhero and Western comics were looked down on. Some of you may have heard that comics were at one point called the marijuana of the nursery because they were supposed to poison the minds of the youth. So they looked down on these mainstream comics, but the thing that they didn't look down on was European comics. This is one of the most popular. Just because they were from Europe, they were okay. They would buy these comics for their kids to read, and luckily my dad took the clue and would buy these comics. I didn't have to spend my allowance on these books because they were fancy European books, ignoring the fact that Tintin is a boy reporter of indeterminate age who travels around the world getting in gunfights with opium gangs. More people die in Tintin comics than in any superhero comics, right? So it was this special secret that I got to learn when I read these books. And I loved them, grew up reading all of them. I'm sure many of you, they're still in print, and I'm sure that the bookstore has copies. Amazing adventure stories. This is a self-portrait I did of myself when I was about 9 years old. There's some salient details here. On the right, you see the sword Excalibur has somehow come into my possession. Next to that, you see I got a diploma from Columbia Pictures. I guess they were giving those out. I think most interesting about this drawing, my mom said this to me about 10 years ago when I opened up the box and looked at it, and I couldn't believe my eyes, because I basically wrote my future in this drawing. In this drawing, I am a cartoonist. You can see on the far left, there's a drawing board. And there's a page of the latest issue of Spider-Man on that drawing board. You can see next to that, there's a memo. It says, from Marvel Comics to Jason L., deadline June 3rd, right? If you look at the calendar, you can see that it's June 8th. And if you look down here in the lower right, there's a little note that says rent due June 1st. So not only was I imagining being a cartoonist, I was imagining missing a deadline. Like I said, I was 10 years late making this book. And I was a starving artist, which I spent a good amount of my life as. I also predicted that I would get glasses, which I did not get until I was 15 years old. So a strangely prophetic drawing that I made. The other thing that happened in Missoula, Montana, when I was about 10 years old in 1977 was this. I went and saw Star Wars 22 times in the movie theater that summer. I paid the matinee price. I must have had a higher allowance, or somehow I was doing extra chores for money, because that's how I spent my allowance that summer. There's no such thing as VHS or DVD or streaming video. So if you wanted to see a movie, you had to go to the movie theater, and I went to the movie theater a lot to watch that movie. For a lot of people, I'm a member of Generation X, but I think a more accurate term would be the Star Wars generation. For better or for worse, I think Star Wars is a strange hegemonic cultural force, and it's strange to see my son kind of sucked into that world, but it had an undeniable impact on me growing up. My parents got divorced around then, and my mom went with my brother and my sister and I to a suburb of San Jose, which was shapeless and without, it was flat. All the houses looked the same. The streets were designed to be kind of rural, but instead created a kind of labyrinth that was easy to get lost in. My first day of fifth grade, I came home and walked into the wrong house. Put my backpack back down, opened up the fridge, didn't know where the Chinese food had come from. Realized that the kitchen had been redecorated overnight, heard footsteps upstairs, and ran out of the house. So I felt very lost compared to Montana, where there was a mountain out my front door, and I did a lot of running around in the woods. Being in suburbia was a completely strange experience where I was untethered. There was no, it was hard to find constructive things to do. It was just shopping malls and these residential streets. But luckily, before I got into trouble, I discovered this crazy thing, which was an invention created by two crackpot Midwesterners. And in this game, which you've probably all heard of at this point, you sit down with your friends and you tell a story together, and the rules of the game just help you, give you guidelines for that story is really all it is. It's a collaborative storytelling game. My friends and I fell in love with it, and we couldn't get enough of it. We would do this to the exclusion of like 500 channel cable and whatever showing down at the movie theater. Like D&D was the thing that we would rather do with our free time. This is what it looked like to be playing D&D with your friends. That's the kid in the blue shirt. This is another internet image, but that kid in the blue shirt is a dead ringer for me, so you can picture me being 15 years old. The wonderful thing about this game is that you're telling a story together, and you don't know where that story is going to go. One person's kind of the host and narrator who kind of runs the story, and then the other players each play a different character, and then how all those characters interact, and the person who's the host, who's called the Dungeon Master, is all the other characters, right? All the secondary characters, and describes the environments. So I was always that person, and that had an enormous impact on my creativity, because it basically put the power into my hands and said, like, you can make whatever you want. And not only that, but you're improvising as you go, and then when you're done, you and your friends have had this amazing shared experience together. So it was a really, really had a powerful influence on me growing up. Also, I am a great admirer of the man in the rainbow suspenders. He looks like a real-life wizard to me. I got out of high school. I drew comics all growing up, and then I decided it was time to put aside childish things and go to go study real art at an art school. So I got into, luckily, the Rhode Island School of Design, and traveled there and decided to put aside childish things like comics and be a real artist. But luckily, my first year there, I discovered this book, which was an anthology of American and European comics that I guess you could describe them as kind of art comics. So they weren't superheroes and cowboys. They were comics that were about all different kinds of things, a lot of them kind of edgy and kind of underground. But the thing that they showed me was that the line between high and low culture, the line between highbrow and lowbrow, was blurry. It was porous, and that there didn't need to be these different categories that you could do. And the more important thing it showed me was that comics was just a medium, right? It's not a thing where only superheroes can exist. It's just words and pictures, and you can tell any kind of story you want. So this book was huge. It was edited by Art Spiegelman, who wrote the book Mouse, which you've probably heard of, and Françoise Mouly, his wife. I also at the time discovered the work of Canadian cartoonist Chester Brown, who showed me that comics could be quiet. Comics it lends itself to kind of broad statements like big action scenes, slapstick comedy, but the real challenge of comics is to do things with subtlety and nuance, and Chester Brown is a Canadian cartoonist who did that. When you bring pauses and quiet into your comics, it gives the reader room to inhabit that space and create their own, make connections on their own and decide for themselves what the character is feeling in this case. Another great cartoonist is Ben Catcher, who does these little ruminations on urban life, and Ben Catcher showed me that comics could be poetry. Around this time, I saw the film Wings of Desire, which ended up having a lasting impact on me. I had forgotten that I had seen it, and then after starting my book Berlin, I went back and looked at it, and I was like, oh my God, this totally got into my mind, because it's about these angels wandering around post-war Berlin, listening in on people's thoughts. And my comic involves a lot of listening in on people's thoughts. Like there's a shifting kind of perspective, and you can hear you can read people's thoughts. And I didn't realize until much later that this film had kind of put that in my head. Also, an amazing, beautiful movie, sort of suffused in the kind of weight of the kind of sadness and the sheer weight of the history that lay behind Germany at the time. When I thought about writers that had influenced me growing up, Ursula Le Guin taught me that you could do a lot with very few words. That book is quite thin. You can read it, in 2 evenings. And using very, very little language, she conjures up an entire fantastic realm. And I remember my imagination just taking off based on her ability to kind of just conjure up images with very, very little detail, very few adjectives. William Faulkner had a big impact on me. I was reading this book out loud with my girlfriend in college, and I was reading. It was my turn to read, and I was reading a paragraph, and I lost track of what the words were about. Right, I was just saying the words, and I lost track of the meaning of what I was saying, and all of a sudden I just broke down and started crying. And there was something about the words themselves somehow unlocked something and made me cry. Like it was the strangest experience. I couldn't even figure out what I was upset about. But William Faulkner showed me that words could be a kind of magic spell if you use them properly. That's right, William Faulkner, real life wizard. Got the pipe and everything. Does anybody know this woman, who the woman in the middle is here? It's very sad. I didn't expect anybody to know her. Her name is Marcia Lucas. She was married to George Lucas. She's holding the Oscar for editing Star Wars, the first Star Wars film. She got the Oscar for editing. Those other 2 dudes, also excellent editors, but Marcia was in charge. You may or may not know that film editing was considered, for a long time in Hollywood, considered secretarial work because it involved, or like a seamstress type work, because it involved chopping and rethreading. Marcia, the initial cut of Star Wars was a complete disaster. So Marcia, who'd been working in Hollywood for a while, took over the job and finished editing that film. She also edited American Graffiti, which put George Lucas on the map. Taxi Driver. Martin Scorsese was stoned out of his mind and couldn't get out of bed, and he called Marcia Lucas to come save his movie, and she came and saved his movie. She edited New York, New York. Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, and half of Return of the Jedi. Those of you who are members of the Star Wars generation know which half Marcia edited. There's a good half and a bad half, or a less good half, I should say. So when I realized looking back at how Star Wars had impacted me, the thing that really dramatically impacted me, there were 2 things. It was the storytelling, which if you have any knowledge of film, you know that the editor has an enormous power when it comes to telling the story. George Lucas is a visionary. He's a technical genius. he conceived this whole story, and he brought the people together to execute it, and it was his idea to have it be this wholly realized fantasy world, and it was an incredible accomplishment. The person who told that story was his wife, or should I say ex-wife, Marcia Lucas. They got divorced halfway through Return of the Jedi. She never worked in Hollywood again. I think she got a really healthy settlement. I don't know if she chose not to work, or there was some kind of prohibition of her working, but it kind of breaks my heart. I hope to one day write a book about Marcia Lucas someday in the future. The other thing she brought to Star Wars was humanity. Anytime you laugh in those movies, it's because Marcia kept that in. They went to a test screening before the film was widely released, and you may recall there's a scene where Luke and Leia are about to swing across a chasm, total swashbuckling move, and she kisses him, and the audience laughed in this test screening, and George said, "We have to cut that." And Marcia said, "Why?" And he said, "Because they laughed." And Marcia said, "No, that's the humanity. We need that in this movie." So it was her that made sure there was warmth in the Star Wars movies, which I think is vital to its success. David Lynch was also a big influence on me. He showed me that if you trust your unconscious, amazing, weird, sometimes insufferable things can happen. His films and television, sometimes it's hard to watch, but the incredible thing about him is that he's earned a place for himself where he can basically do whatever his unconscious tells him. He can follow his impulse, and hasn't compromised. He compromised once in his career and decided never to do it again, and so I admire that about him. I moved to Seattle, Washington after I graduated from the Rhode Island School of Design, where this newspaper came out, and I was offered the opportunity to do a weekly strip for it. And when I got this opportunity, I looked back at my childhood influences, and I remembered Tintin. And I also remembered that Tintin originally was published in serialized form in a children's supplement called Le Petit Vingtième in Belgium. This is the first 2 pages of the very first Tintin story. It was great for me to look at this because I could see that Hergé, the artist's name is Hergé, he's considered a modern master of comics, and growing up, I certainly helped him in that regard. So it was really great to see his early drawing, to see how simple it was. And what I learned from going back and reading Tintin was how to tell a story very straightforwardly and clearly, which is super important. And also how comics is a physical structure. This is a 2-page spread. On the lower right-hand corner, you can see that there's an explosion, and that's a cliffhanger that you have to pick up next week's paper to read the next installment of, right? In a book, when you're looking at a 2-page spread, if you put a cliffhanger then, the reader has to turn that page to get the surprise to follow up on that. So the actual physical constraint of a comic book can play directly into how the story is read. And I learned that from Hergé. So I was living in this house in Seattle, Washington, and I had a dream about a woman melting through my arms, and I took that dream image and I started telling a story 1 page at a time, making it up as I went. I had no idea in these first few panels that the guy on the right actually was a magician. I found that out as I wrote the story. So this story is about an unemployed magician who is trying to get over a failed relationship. And that was collected into this book, Jar of Fools, which in another weird synchronicity, your first book is called Life in a Jar, which is a strange coincidence as well. I was finishing up that book. That book of Jar of Fools is very much my sort of self-education in comics, trying to understand how comics work. And I discovered this book, which is called Bertolt Brecht's Berlin. In fact, I didn't discover the actual book. I discovered an ad for the book, just one little paragraph. I think it was in The Nation or The Atlantic. And I read the paragraph and I said to myself, that's it. That's the next thing I'm going to do. It's going to be 600 pages long and it's going to be about Berlin between the wars. And I didn't know anything about Berlin between the wars. I'd seen Cabaret or half of Cabaret at one point, but I made the decision then and started that crazy process, which involved 2 years of research, gone through these bookstores and libraries as I tried to understand the city and its context. And after those 2 years, and in that time I read Berlin Alexanderplatz, which I'm sure you've read. Right? Amazing impressionistic novel. People have called Berlin the German James Joyce in terms of his modernist approach to narrative. I started making drawings of characters. I would always start with a real world example. This is a self-portrait in the lower left there by Katie Kollwitz, a German artist, and then I would use that as the basis for my character Martha, and then I would put aside the source image and then just allow her to be her own character separate from that. I would do that for all of my characters, find some existing photograph or painting, and then use it as the basis for somebody to be a fictional character in my story. And there's also some real life characters that show up. Joachim Ringelnatz was a poet and performer living in Berlin at the time, and Karl Wojnarowski was a newspaper editor who was tried for treason and sent to prison for speaking out against the Germany's rearmament which was in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, among other things. Before I started writing the story, I made highfalutin lists of what the story was going to be about, like you can see there, emotions, joy, fear, anger, envy, love, sadness, senses, sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch. I wanted to figure out what you could do with comics. I wanted to explore the medium itself while I was telling the story, so I made these like kind of grandiose plans about what the story was going to cover, and thankfully that all eventually fell by the wayside, and I could just pay attention to the characters. And then when I write an individual chapter, I sit down and I make what we call in comics thumbnail drawings. Each one of those little pages is about 1 inch tall in my notebook, and I need to see the images there on the page as I'm working out the dialogue. The words and the pictures directly interact with each other, so I need to understand that interaction. And the only way to do that is to make little diagrams. So this is all the kind of draft work is at this stage. I'll do on the right, you can see a pencil version where I'll erase and rewrite and erase and rewrite. And by rewrite, I mean change the drawings, the little tiny drawings as well as the words, until I get it to a point where I like it. Later on, I developed a method of taking each chapter and developing an outline, where that's just a list of pages 1 through 24. Each chapter is 24 pages long. And I would, on each page, I would just write a single sentence about what happens on that page, and that would help me organize my story. And then I would take that outline and turn it into these thumbnails. I would look at a thumbnail, and I would figure out what kind of visual reference I needed. In this case, I needed a telephone booth, which I found in an old book. Making sure that, anything I use for reference or shows up in the background is definitely on the street or was there in Berlin in whatever year the story is taking place. And then that goes into the pencil version of the page. And then I found this amazing, a friend of mine in Berlin found me this amazing book, Streetcars of Berlin. And I could find, Jack was saying, he used the same map as I did to imagine Berlin in the 20s and 30s. And for this scene, which happened on a particular street corner, I was able to find the actual streetcar that would have gone by that street corner. I use this as an example of extreme success. Most of the time, 90% of the time, I'm kind of winging it, but this was an example of where I knew for a fact that was the right streetcar. And that's what it looks like in the finished pencils. And then that's what my rough pencils look like. I'm figuring out how it's all gonna, this is all based on those thumbnail drawings I showed you. Then I clean up the pencils, I kind of tighten them up and polish them, and then the final thing I do is I would letter next, and then I would ink the final art. So I wrote the first 3 chapters, which came out as individual floppy comic books, like you might picture when you picture a comic book. And then I took a step back and figured out what characters had arisen. So that list on the left, the top 2 characters, you can see Martha Miller and Kurt Seveling at the very top there, and then everybody else just kind of emerged from the story as I explored the city. So these are all the characters I had introduced up to that point, and then these are all the events or elements that had occurred that I needed to address. Kurt's pacifism, for example, Republic versus Empire, Marta's interest in Pola, and then themes that had kind of arisen. And this was just to kind of like take a breather, organize my thoughts before I sort of dove back into the next 13 chapters. And those together, each 8 chapters comprised a collected book. You can see 2 of them up here, sandwiched between the big stacks up front. So there was a trilogy, and then this big fat book is the collection of all those. So those first 2 books came out, I don't even remember the dates anymore, it was so long ago. But between them, I moved to Vermont, because I got this great, offered this great teaching job at a MFA program in comics. up in White River Junction. See, there's a city theme here, right? My book's about Berlin, and I'm going through all the cities where I live, trying to have that. And at the Center for Cartoon Studies, that's where I teach. It's my day job right now. This is the graduating class of 2011. Great bunch of kids, all who moved to Vermont to pursue their passion in making comics. And this was a particularly special year for me because on the left there, those two folks right there, that's Art Spiegelman and Francoise Louis, who were heroes of mine. Francoise was the commencement speaker that year, so it was really special for me to be able to sort of host them when they came up for the school. The last thing I'll show you is the last page of part 2 of my book. So this is chapter 16, last page of chapter 16, spoilers. This is what the thumbnail looked like. 2 of the characters are leaving the city on a plane to fly to Paris. That middle panel there, one of the reasons I make these little tiny thumbnail drawings is because I don't get intimidated by what it's going to mean to actually draw them when it comes down to it. So I can do things like, oh, that's a building, or here's a crowd of people, and it's just a scribble. In this case, this was the Parliament. This was inside the Reichstag at the elections of 1930. And I just made this little scribble imagining what the inside of the Reichstag was like. And then I went digging and I found this amazing photograph that showed me what the Reichstag looked like after those elections. And what is striking about this photograph is that you can see, it's black and white, but the upper half, almost half of the people sitting there are all lighter in shade. You all see that? That's because they're wearing brown shirts. Those are all members of the Nazi Party. This is the year that they swept into office. They came into the government to dismantle the Republic. That was their express goal, which may sound unfortunately familiar. It's an amazing photograph to discover, and also shows that I'm not above tracing. I'm a big believer. Sometimes tracing is really great because you can actually, drawing anything, you learn it by drawing. By drawing a thing, you actually you get to know a thing. And tracing has a similar effect. By tracing this, I had to figure out how the furniture worked in this room, figure out all the the wall paneling and the clothing. And I always tell my students it's totally fine to trace. What you don't want is to have the tracing end up looking like a photograph because then it can feel kind of distant and cold. Always try to have the warmth of your hand in there. Somehow that's what the finished drawing looked like. And that's how it looked on the finished page. The voiceover is a radio announcer, and at the end there he says, causing citizens, this is when the seats, the National Socialist seats went from 12 to 107 that year. There were 32 political parties in the Reichstag. I think that's right. It's like over 30. 29, okay, not quite 30. 29, thank you. If you can imagine that, 29 different political parties in Germany, which was something that Hitler used to use very much. So. And then the announcer asks right there, what is the fate of the Weimar Republic? As these two characters fly off to Paris. Yeah, so it took me 22 years, 22 issues just randomly. That's just a strange coincidence. And like I said, I always miss deadlines. The end.
Jack, will you just sit forward and use your mic, please? Thank you.
Tell us the lettuce.
I just didn't like lettuce, that's all. I was famous at Thanksgiving for just having a plate of brown food. I didn't like green food at all. Big story.
So I've read the big one, The Doorstopper, twice now already, and I got to tell you, it is magnificent. I mean, I have a real strong sort of personal affinity for this story because I've been immersed in it for only a little bit longer than Jason. But we both have sort of plumbed the same slice of history that is both compelling and critical and cautionary, and we both started doing this at a time when it was not a cautionary tale. So there's something
I'm really curious, actually, what did any particular thing inspire you to start your book?
Yes, a Yom Kippur sermon. I was at a Yom Kippur service at Middlebury College in 1992, and Fritz Rothschild was the rabbi, and his Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the Jewish year, and it's a day where you where you seek forgiveness from God for sins that you've committed against God, and you're pleading before the court of heaven for forgiveness, for atonement, for redemption. But sins between individuals have to be atoned person to person. But he told the story of this fascist assassin who murdered someone, Walter Rathenau, the highest-ranking foreign minister of Weimar Germany, who was a Jew, and his redemption. And the story was that story that started me on this quest. It just would not let me go. And then when I started, I'm a German Jew, so I have some connection to this history in that way as well. But once I started, and I'm sure you probably had the same experience, once you go down this rabbit hole of Weimar history, it's astounding. Having taken history courses, I didn't know anything about this history, or knew the top crust of this history. But once you go into it and start learning the dynamics of how ordinary people became complicit in extraordinary crimes, it's not just individual it's individual aberrations, but it's also aberrations of a nation and how this could happen, and it's just astounding. And then to personal, and this is a question I wanted to ask you, or pose for you, is this question of historical fiction. And one of the things that allowed me to do Before the Court of Heaven in the way I did was that it was taking the facts of history, taking some of the individuals who made this history, and then animating it. And you have animated it in a way that I could never animate, and a whole dimension of animation. But how the difference between the sort of dry expository history that we all have read, that we all learned in school, and the animation and the personalization and the emotional connection that historical fiction allows, to then try and figure out how ordinary people responded to living in these times.
Yeah. I had a public high school education in California, and my history, so California, right? Western United States, far away from Europe, far away from, and I'm not Jewish, but I had Jewish friends, but I didn't know they were Jewish because it just wasn't a thing, right? It wasn't something people broadcasted, it was just they were just people. And I remember this one day I went into history class, and it was like world history, and I sat down, and my history teacher unfortunately had this habit of pouring a fifth of vodka into a big gulp, and spending the class, sucking on this big gulp. My heart goes out to the man now, because now, looking back, I realize that he must have just been really struggling with his rambunctious suburban class of high school history students. And I remember one day he went out to get his big gulp to the 7-Eleven. So we left class, but before we left class, he put in a VHS cassette and he left the room. And the VHS cassette was, all of a sudden, it was like bulldozers pushing bodies into trenches. And I had, at this point, I was 15 years old, never even knew the Holocaust existed. Did not know. And that was my very first kind of exposure to it. And I think, in retrospect, what I realized, and then I went to art school, so I didn't study history. That was it. I mean, I learned a lot more on my own, right? But then I came out to the East Coast and went to RISD, and I met lots of Jewish people, and I took a class on Jewish folklore, and and I started to educate myself. But one of the things I realized after I started my book, about 200 pages into it, I realized that's what I was doing, was educating myself. Like, I needed to know, I needed to understand how that happened. And it was very much like, what was it like on the street? Like, what was it like for people, just average people, And it turns out what it was like is what it's like for us, which is that you have a day job. You don't have a lot of time to like be in the street, fighting for what you believe in if you've got to feed your family. There's that aspect to it, which I hadn't really thought much about, having had a relatively comfortable, middle class existence my own self. The luxury of going to art school, as an example. And I also learned that I was of German descent, but we don't know a lot of details about it. I only learned that after I started the book. In a very strange coincidence, my brother, around the time I started this book, started a band called Dresden. We had not been in communication for years, and he started up this band called Dresden. So on some level, I'm convinced that the Jungian collective unconscious is playing a part here. And when you say we started these projects at a time when it was not in the forefront of our minds that was an issue that we would have to contend with. But as I was working on this book, I got to the point where the May Day demonstrations of 1929 happened. That month that I was working on that, the WTO protests in Seattle happened, which is where I was living. So outside my front door, the police were beating protesters. And then later, when I was writing about the stock market crash of 1929, the financial crisis occurred. So there were these very strange resonances. It was like my book was like a super slowed down, the real world was a super slowed down version of what I was writing in my book. And the third and most unfortunate coincidence is that I finished it, shortly after the elections of 2016 and all of the stuff that brought up. So it was this very strange thing with this effort to educate myself about this particular period of history ended up having way more kind of resonance with my actual life than I ever anticipated.
The other sort of interesting thought that I had to read, this is a book about Berlin, and I was mindful throughout as I was reading it that what was happening in Berlin was, the population of Berlin at that time was about 4.5 million, and the population of Germany was 64.5 million people. So what happened in Berlin was maybe 5% of the population. And what was happening in the art scene and the cabaret scene and the sexual experimentation and sexual freedom and jazz and expressionism and it was a time of experimentation, and it was a time when the rest of the country, the other 60 million Germans, were looking upon it either scratching their heads or yelling some obscenity at what was going on in Berlin. And it was the degeneracy of Berlin that was fodder for Hitler and the Nazis. So it's interesting to have this very laser-like focus on Berlin, which was really one of the irritants that provoked and sustained and fertilized the Nazi movement. Because most of the appeal of Hitler was to rural Protestant Germans. And they looked upon this as the ultimate of cultural excess and degeneracy.
I'm fascinated with cities as gathering that kind of cosmopolitan place as gathering places. Cities grew up for any number of reasons, but initially it's like source of fresh water and natural resources, and then more and more people move there, and when more and more people gather in a place, people who are marginalized and on the edges in their home communities, in their little villages or whatever, start to find people, for instance, who are also gay. Cities are where those things happen. Or artists will rub shoulders with other artists, and they'll create social circles in cities because there aren't enough people where they live to do that. And so in a place like that, you had all these different groups, scientists moving to centers of research so that they could, focus on their work. All of these kind of intense many frontiers are being kind of pushed forward in a city, and then that kind of pioneering aspect of culture is magnified by the fact that there's other groups doing it because they're all bouncing off each other, and that part of it became super fascinating to me. And then as a result of that, it's a direct kind of contradiction to other cultural values, more dominant cultural values held generally by the mainstream populace.
I mean, it really is a culture. It's a reaction flask. It's a culture medium, which requires a certain critical mass. And when you put those people together who have that creative energy, then you get Berlin.
Exactly. That very first image of the city I showed you, there's a traffic tower in that intersection that puts Weimar plots. And when I found the photograph, I was like, what is that? It looks like it's like a 15-foot high wooden structure with a clock on it, or looks like a clock. And I couldn't figure out what it was, and I did some research and I figured out it was a traffic tower, and there was a police officer in it controlling traffic because it was like a 5-way intersection. It was the first traffic light in Europe. And the idea that like there was enough traffic where they couldn't just wait for find your way through. You needed somebody to direct that traffic as like an illustration of that kind of intensity of that kind of like on a technological level, right? And on a level of like human mass transportation, like it became necessary for us to organize that stuff, especially the Germans to organize that stuff.
Right. And that scene in the book with the traffic guy, and this is one of the beautiful things about Jason's book, we're with the guy in that traffic control booth, and where the bubbles are what he's thinking, and he's thinking just off the wall stuff. It has nothing to do. First he thinks about the traffic, but then he's thinking about what he's going to have for dinner. I don't remember exactly what it was. So it's like you have this immersion into you have this. It's this sort of collision of this hyper dynamic metropolis and this ordinary guy's contemplation.
I think he's constipated. He thinks about that.
We're so humanizing, and that's just one. This occurs throughout the book because we really do have a lot of interior sort of thought bubbles and interior monologues throughout the book, which were beautiful and wonderful and very poetic. You mentioned that. You point that off beautifully. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions? Or?
How do you come by your German language?
I don't speak German. I don't speak or read German.
Do you read it?
Much to my embarrassment, no. I don't. I've only spent 5 days in Berlin, and I didn't go for the first time until I was 200 pages into the story. So, I'm an amateur.
Did you ever finish watching Cabaret?
I don't think I did.
I recommend it. It's one of my favorite movies.
Okay, great. I will take that away. I'm taking a little break from Weimar, Germany right now. Like apparently there's the show Babylon Berlin on Netflix that is supposed to be really amazing, but I haven't seen that either. But I will put Cabaret. I will put Cabaret on my list.
My book also has a cabaret scene, and there's lots of cabaret in Berlin, in Jason's book, and many wild, wonderful scenes, but I have to say that the most fun I had as a writer was writing that cabaret scene of any part of the book, because you couldn't make up what was going on in the cabaret scene in Berlin, and if you had made it up, you would be called a liar. And it was truly just off the edge, and so so progressive and inspired madness and of all of the arts.
There's a Netflix series called Berlin, and I wondered if you had seen it. I found it, I just sort of stumbled on it and found it absolutely mesmerizing. It's about the same period, obviously very different. But I would highly recommend it for somebody who wants to look at this whole scene in another way.
Yeah, I've heard that it's really great. A lot of people have recommended it.
It is.
It's also in color, which is weird. Is there a question?
I have more important questions in my mind, but I'm just going to ask you about the volume of your book.
Yeah.
When I think about it, I would love to get involved, but I know I'm committing myself to 20 years of reading. So you chose this. Was there an intention to really get the reader immersed, to the point of living it?
Yeah. My approach was, I'm going to put myself there. I'm going to imagine that I am these characters. I'm going to imagine the place as thoroughly as I can, put myself in their shoes, see what, in any given scene that happens, I imagine, it goes back to my Dungeons and Dragons roots. I try to imagine being these different characters and what they would say to each other. And it very much for me was an exploration of history, because I was trying to educate myself, and of the actual physical city, and of the culture. So it felt like a very exploratory process, and my hope is that that feeling of exploration carries over to the reader's experience, and that I do want the reader to feel like they have some sense of what it was like to live on the street. In the end, it's always just my little personal Berlin in a shoebox fantasy version of what it might have been like. But that's the hope, is that will carry over.
You mentioned that each chapter was the same number of pages. Did you say how many pages?
24.
24. And I'm wondering about that because I've often heard for the creative process that constriction or some kind of structure fuels creativity. And I was wondering why you did that, if that was why.
Yeah, all of my work involves a kind of formal structure, a pretty strict one, that then I improvise inside of. And I think that the structure gives me a sense of it's not really safety, but it's like a kind of foundation. Like if I know that I only have 24 pages, and this isn't a web comic where you're not limited by the actual page. I have these page spreads. I have these physical limitations on what I can do. And when I have that, it allows me to make hard decisions. Like you have to edit, you have to fit whatever you want to get across into those 24 pages. I'm always telling my students that it's more important to set yourself a page count and try to hit that page count than to just write, and then hopefully end up at an ending someday. At least in the beginning, it's good to create these little discrete sort of boxes that you can do everything inside of. So that for me, it's this combination of creating a structure, and there was the physical structure, and then there's also the structure of historical events. Like real history is unfolding in my story, so I know that at the end of chapter 8, the May Day demonstration happens. So between here and chapter 8, I know I'm working towards that. So there's these narrative kind of linchpins in there too. And those things create a kind of matrix that I kind of find my way through, I guess, or like a labyrinth that I explore to try to get to somewhere. I didn't know the ending until I was about 100 pages out. And then I had several I was working on, several I had in the air, and then I went to Berlin for the second time, and I have a cousin who lives there. And we were walking down the street, and he loves me. He's a big fan of my book, and he really wanted me to finish it. And he said, "Have you thought about this?" And it was exactly what I'd been thinking about. And so that told me that was the right ending. Out of 4 different ones that I was juggling with. I think the other thing was that my first book, Jar of Fools, was very much me processing this relationship I had actually had. The character dancing and the woman melting through his arms. I didn't realize until I was done that it was just about my college relationship. And it should have been just really obvious, but I didn't know because I was just following my instinct, right? And I remember before I set out to write this book, one of the decisions I made was I wanted it to be about other people. It's always going to be autobiography to one degree or another because it reflects my interests, but I really wanted it to be about people that were different from me.
I also didn't know how my book was going to end until I went for a long hike with a friend of mine, and he suggested the ending. So that's good.
Oh, and he suggested the ending. Okay. The other thing is just walking in general, moving in general, as I'm sure you know, for the creative process is absolutely vital. Whenever you're stuck, just get out and move. Yep. It really helps. You said you had some more good questions.
You're putting me on the spot. It diverts a little bit from your book. It is more about the whole genre of graphic novels
Yeah.
that is so popular.
Yeah.
And for children
Yeah.
and for youth, and they tackle really, really serious problems. And I'm just wondering whether this is a sign of a new generation absorbing visuals better and, maybe
Yeah,
it should
there's a couple of contributing factors there. When I started this book in the 90s, there weren't a lot of examples of historical fiction in comics. There's more now, but there weren't a whole lot. There was mainstream superhero type stuff, and then there was what they would call alternative comics, which were kind of like edgy, underground, kind of taboo breaking kind of things. So for somebody to do it relatively dry historical fiction was very unusual. There wasn't much of a market for it. Bookstores recognized that these bound comic books had an audience, and so they created the term graphic novel. They didn't invent it, but they popularized it and turned it into a marketing term to make it appeal to adults more, right? With some success. People now know the term graphic novel, which is great. I always call it comics. It's all comics, but it's a great descriptor and helpful in that sense. Around that same time, there was an American publisher who was importing and translating Japanese comics, manga, as they're called in Japan, translating them into English, and those were getting out into bookstores and libraries. So kids, people who are 5, 6, 7 years old in 1995 were growing up with a whole new kind of realm of comics. And that generation is now 25 years old, and those comics have stayed in the bookstores and libraries, and more of them have gotten produced. Right now, the comics market, the graphic novel market, is the fastest growing segment of the book market. Every big publisher now, if they don't already have a graphic novel imprint, is starting one, because it's just like exploding. Raina Telgemeier, if anybody has, she's an amazing, she did a book called Ghosts. She did another one called Smile. Her next book, I think, is just out of the gate going to sell 1 million copies, because there's just an audience just totally hungry for whatever she does next. So it's a really growing thing. And I've raised my kids with comics. They're completely they've got no shortage of books to read, but they consume the comics voraciously. My son has basically learned to read by reading comics, which is great. And it's just a really interesting time right now. And every year I get a new crop of students in their early 20s at the school where I teach who are just like super excited. And the best thing is they're all doing is 20 different subjects. Like it's 20 different individual, very personal perspectives and ideas. They're not all trying to create comics of a certain genre or a certain style. They're individually, they're authors, and they're writing whatever kind of comics they want to write.
And we do have a wonderful graphic novel section at the bookshop.
Excellent.
It's small.
Excellent.
It's on the bottom shelf, but I'm thinking about moving it up.
It's not just for kids anymore.
It's
well
very
prized.
carefully curated.
Do you have Annie Sullivan and the Trials of Helen Keller? Do you have that book?
I don't know.
Okay. Well, then I won't recommend people go buy it, but look it up.
I will.
It's an amazing. We've all heard the story of Helen Keller. It's this book that just came back into print, and it's a story of Annie Sullivan, Helen Keller's teacher, and Helen Keller coming to learn how to communicate. So it's the story of the miracle worker, right? The film and stage play, but it's done in comics, which is crazy because it's a visual medium, right? And it's about this person who can't, and it more than any other thing that I've ever read or ever seen, it captures the feeling of what it might have been like to be Helen Keller. It's amazing. And the scene where she learns how to communicate is like one of the most incredible pieces of art ever that I've ever seen. And I'm not exaggerating. It's a really great book. And it just came back into print, so the Vermont Book Shop.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
We have books.